Welcome back to D&D Module Monday. Man, it has been a minute since I've filmed one of these. Not a minute since I've released one of them, but it has been a minute since I filmed one of them. I actually got super far ahead at one point, and I was like, I need to chill out before, for obvious reasons. Just getting a little too far ahead of myself. But anyway, really excited to be filming another one here today. Couple things before we get into it. So, first off, I should just point this out. They're doing construction around my house. So if you hear construction noises, I apologize, but I really cannot do anything about that. Also, if you hear dogs barking at any point, I cannot do anything about that either. I know I mentioned that in a previous video. I think it was my very, very first video about Tomb of Horrors, because that's the only one I filmed at night. So basically, people behind me have a whole bunch of dogs. And they used to bark at night, because I believe at night they are either put in a pen or chained up. Well, recently, some of my neighbors and fellow people basically called the township on them because their dogs used to run around the neighborhood. And it wasn't good, it's not safe. I once saw one of their dogs almost get hit by a car. This, border collie looking dog. I don't actually think it's a border collie, but it looked like it. And so now I think they just keep them chained up all day. Or in a pen, as I said. And they just bark all day. Literally nonstop. I mean, that's really not an exaggeration. I mean, they're not barking actively right now, but they probably bark every hour, on the hour. I mean, it's brutal. And they're obviously distressed, and I feel awful. I had to put my dog down literally within the last week, and I just feel awful for those dogs. But in that respect, if you do hear them barking, I apologize, but again, there's literally nothing I can do about it, because I think, unfortunately, they just don't treat their animals very well. But anyway, back to that's a very, very sad note to start on, but I figured I should get that out of the way. Anyway, some changes that I'm going to be making to D&D Module Monday. So I've really been enjoying making these, and I'm still enjoying making them. One of the biggest changes that I'm going to make is that I want to talk more about a story and my own personal opinions, as opposed to strict reviews. Not that I dislike doing the reviews, but the reviews were very arduous, and they led to these being a lot longer than I really wanted them to be. Mainly in the way that I had to pick through and go through every single little bit of information in the module. So so from here, from henceforth, I am going to more so look at a piece of material and then try to talk about it as I see fit, and my own experiences and stories surrounding it, in a way that I hope will be a bit more interesting than me just being like, this is cool, going through this, look at that, look at this, and whatnot. Now, part of me feels like an idiot for starting with this one, because it seems like a bad idea, but you know what? We're going to do it anyway. We are going to talk about the complete Psionics Handbook for 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Now, there were a couple reasons that I wanted to take a look at this supplement. Psionics are, by my estimation, probably the most divisive class in the history of D&D. Now, a brief backstory for anyone that might not be aware. Psionics were around in original Dungeons & Dragons, first appearing in a supplement, but they really took effect in the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. And in that edition, psionics were not actually a class. Psionics were just a set of skills, effectively, that any character could learn, provided you were lucky enough to roll that granted your character psionic abilities. Psionic abilities obviously being things like mind control, the ability to manipulate objects, manipulate your own body, the environment around you at times, stuff like that. It was, as you can imagine, very broken in first edition Dungeons & Dragons, because having first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which was so structured, which was so rigid, more so. I mean, every D&D edition is structured, but yeah, more rigid. Having characters randomly be given the ability to perform psionic talents was really, as you could probably imagine, really broken. Having, a fighter that could then mind blast people and screw with them in ways that very, very, very few other characters could, and very few characters had ways to defend against, was, again, as you can imagine, very broken. So what the purpose of this second edition handbook is to make psionics a proper class. In this supplement, and here on forth in any form that psionics have taken in Dungeons & Dragons, psionics are a class. Now, ironically, I say that, if we look here, I forget which page it is, but I will find it. Page 19. The ability for non-psionic characters to actually still gain psionic powers is still present in this version. They are referred to what's called wild talents. But the prevalence and abilities of wild talents are very, very neutered in comparison to what they were. It's more so just almost like a flavor thing to be like, oh, look, this person could have been a psionic if they wanted to be, but they're not. It's more so like that. So, you might be asking yourself, I should also point out, if you are newer to D&D, psionics nowadays are more typically referred to as mystics. You might be wondering, Sir Fandrax, what do you mean by the fact that psionics are one of the most divisive classes probably ever in D&D? It's because no one can decide whether they're good or not, and whether or not they belong in the game. I could just tell you, go on out and do a very quick Google search, and there are still people on forums, on Reddit, on places as such, that have discussions about whether or not psionics are the greatest thing ever, or the worst thing ever. I remember specifically, I believe it was XP to level 3, made a video about mystics, which is the 5th edition equivalent of psionics. And he is someone that I would say is pretty firmly not a fan of psionics. And I would say in general, in my opinion, for the most part, though there are the two extremes, you have people that love psionics and people that hate psionics, more so than not, people are not typically seemingly a huge fan of psionics. And so the question is why? Why is that? Because at first, when I pondered that question, my first thought was, well, people must not like new classes being added to D&D. But when I thought about that, that's not really the case. I mean, we have added classes to the existing scope of D&D on numerous occasions. Warlocks, artificers, even something a little stranger like you have all the class kits, even something really odd like the Blood Hunter that Critical Role's Matthew Mercer created, or the Gunslinger that he also created for that effect. What I'm saying is, we have added classes beyond the expected fighter, mage, thief, cleric, paladin sort of grouping, and people don't have nearly the issue with them that they've had with psionics. And it was after reading this rulebook again, I had read it once previously. It was in reading this rulebook again that, in my opinion, why I think psionics have never really been accepted all that well became fairly evident. And I think a lot of that spite and dislike, I think it stems primarily from two places. One, I think some people just don't think they fit. And I think that's a very, very fair issue to have. They feel, even though psionics are a type of magic, and they are referred to as a type of magic in this book, although I should point out that the book itself claims that D&D... this handbook itself, which is all about introducing a class which uses a new form of magic, outright states that it's probably not needed. Which is kind of interesting. Mr. I forget who wrote this. My mistake. It's not on the front. Hang on. I think it's Steve something. Design... Steve Winter. Mr. Winter, with all due respect, pointing out how the book you're writing might not be entirely necessary on some of the first pages, probably not the greatest idea. For one, I think most people just don't think they fit. There is... the majority of D&D universes are some form of fantasy, most typically high fantasy worlds. Think, obviously the Forgotten Realms, Dragonlance, Mystara, stuff like that. Very, very much influenced by the works of, say, Tolkien. So the majority of D&D worlds are high fantasy. And the psionics as a whole, even when you take a look at some of the abilities that they hold, feel very sci-fi. It's very much based around the mind and mind duels between multiple psionics. Their weapon skills, and as far as the armors were, fairly limited. The ability to sort of see things in a way that, again, not only can no other class really do, but is through the use of things such as clairvoyance. It's very sci-fi. To me, it was strikingly Star Wars, actually. When I was reading through these abilities, and there are 6 different areas of psionic capabilities that psionics have. So if you think in the sense of mages or sorcerers, they have evocation spells, enchantment spells, transmutation spells, necromancy spells. Psionics have various, basically, sciences, as they're called, and then they can learn what are called devotions, which are effectively spells within those sciences. And obviously, as they grow more powerful, they learn more sciences, more devotions, blah, blah, blah. But they have things like this psychokinesis, which is basically exploding things. They have one that's called clairsentience, which allows them to discern locations and visuals and see things from afar. Beyond that, they have metabolic abilities. Like I said, that affects their own body, psychometabolism. So they have all these spells that work in a very different way. And like I said, it feels very sci-fi. Even if, in some cases, the devotions themselves, being the spells, effectively, do very similar things as the mage variants. So I think there's that. I think the majority of people generally just don't believe that psionics really fit into the typical D&D world. And I think that's fair. Secondly, and this for me is the bigger thing. I will profess, I think psionics do fit in the majority of D&D worlds. I think the idea that people can cast spells and throw fireballs at each other and perform feats of wondrous strength, I think it's very reasonable to assume that there would be people with mind talents. There are creatures in many fantasy D&D worlds with mind talents, most notably mind flayers. Those creatures are now basically a central part of the campaign in the newest critically acclaimed Baldur's Gate game. So the idea that characters could not have psychic talents always felt a little odd to me. So that is not where my issue with psionics comes in. My issue with psionics stems more from the fact that if you take a look at this index, chapters 3 through 8, encompassing almost 80 pages, is just the abilities that psionics have and can learn in the form of their sciences and devotions. Mind you, these abilities are only prevalent and usable by one class. If you were a dungeon master, would you really want to have an entire handbook and have to learn hundreds of spells, which it boasts? It boasts that there are over 150 different spells and devotions or sciences, whatever you want to call them, for one class. I understand there are a lot of spells for clerics and druids and mages and sorcerers, but those spells are also shared between multiple classes. This is one class that is extremely complex with a high number of abilities that also features a sort of bending of the rules in a way that no other class does. And what I mean by that is, rather than having, say, spell slots, psionics have psionic strength points, which is what they cast their spells from. They also have numerous different ways that their powers take effect, which is based on how they hit their opponents, how they connect with their opponents, if they're fighting another psionic. Oh god. If two psionics try to use psionic abilities against each other, oh my god. It is like pulling teeth, because psionics naturally have defenses against psionic abilities. So then if two psionics start going at each other, they have to try to break through each other's defenses. They have to make contact. They have to roll about 87 different times before they can even use the ability that they then have to roll to use again. They have some pretty strict racial limits, although this was also more so a product of the time. They have... Here's the psionic strength points. They have... The way they're rolled... Let me bring this up. So, the way they roll... So, each ability is influenced by their stats, as you could see here. These are the... So if I wanted to use this one here, animate object, right, intelligence -3. So that finds something, that influences something called the power score. You have to roll beneath your power score for it to be successful, right? So your power score in this situation would be your intelligence -3. So if you have an intelligence of 15, your power score is now 12. So anything 12 and below equals you succeed. If you roll your power score, that is effectively your version of a critical hit. If you roll a 20, it is a critical failure. So now you have a class that is not only operating very differently with completely new spells, you now have it not operating within these sort of established universal game rules in the way that they effectively have mana instead of spell slots. They have different sort of sliders and parameters for actually casting these spells. There is a lot, and I mean a lot, going on with psionics in basically every form they've ever taken. And for my money's worth, it really is, in most cases, just more trouble than it's worth. It becomes it's not easy to play. It's certainly not a class that new players should even attempt to play, because it's so convoluted and so it's so detailed. That is one thing I will say about this assessment, this book. It's certainly very detailed. It does that very well. But the idea that anyone but the most sort of tuned in and veteran player could actually reasonably play a psionic is kind of far-fetched, unfortunately. Because again, there is so much to manage between all these spells, between the way that spells interact with each other, between the way that psionics, if they fight each other, interact with each other. There's also the issue that if you were playing a normal class, a fighter, a thief, a paladin, whatever, the presence of psionics meant you had an entirely new area of magic that you had to plan and defend yourself against. Previously, the need to protect yourself from mental assault was really reserved, again, to mind flayers and a select few other enemies. And I think all of that comes together to just make something that feels very convoluted, very like it almost exists outside, as I said, of the scope of how you expect to play Dungeons and Dragons, because it rolls so differently and it has to go about combat in such a different way. I don't think it's a bad thing that it opens up doors, because it does. Some of these abilities, such as the way you can, like I say, even here, conceal thoughts, you can tap into the world around you, the people around you, and also how you can protect yourself. I think that's very interesting. I think opening up more avenues for such in D&D is very smart. But to do it in such a tough way, combined with the fact that a lot of people already were not very thrilled with how they thought this class or set of abilities fit into their campaign, I think is what has led to a lot of the sort of frustration with psionics and mystics over the years, many of which I think are long-standing. This was my father's book, and when I brought it up to him that I was going to talk about it, that I really wanted to talk about psionics and sort of some of the history, the first thing he said to me was incredibly confusing. That was the very, very first thing he said to me. He said as a group of kids, he played predominantly when he was a kid with his friends and his brothers and whatnot. He said trying to figure out how to make psionics work was almost impossible. That's another thing I think was probably very real. A lot of kids played Dungeons & Dragons when this stuff was coming out. And I can tell you, this is a very complicated class, even just on the premise of keeping track of everything. Like I said, you have to keep track of what sciences you know, what devotions you know, what defenses you have up at any given time. Every class has a maintenance cost and preparation times, and like I said, to say nothing of the power scores and the fact that they could be very frustrating. If you don't meet your power scores, you now then obviously fail to cast the devotion. It's a very, very, very complicated class that, again, I can see how people think they don't fit. Because not only do some people think they don't fit on a thematic level, they really don't fit in a gameplay sense either. And that, I think, is the bigger thing here. Like I said earlier, I think the bigger thing is that these classes, that the way psionics are written, they just feel like they don't fit from a gameplay format. This very much feels like fitting a square peg in a round hole. It feels like Mr. Winter, with all due respect to him, just kind of said, okay, I've just watched the Star Wars trilogy. How can I make this now work in D&D? And I think he did as good a job as he did. I will say this is a fine supplement. Very well written, very descriptive, very, the images inside are actually outstanding. These images are great. And there's a lot of imagery in this book, actually. But my favorite part of the book, actually, is probably, if I go to the back, it provides new monsters, but also adapts some old ones with new psionic talents and whatnot. This is very, very nice and very much appreciated. I I think Psionics, if I could put it in any, it even gives you a bunch of like books that it tells you should read to try and get an idea of how psionics work, which goes to show you how much some of this was influenced by outside sources. Psionics almost feel like something, because when you read these monster entries, it's like, oh wow, this makes sense that the monster could do this and that, and it provides a unique challenge. It almost feels like something that NPCs should have, but maybe players shouldn't. And I know that probably sounds really weird, but I do think that is the truth sometimes. That sometimes it's just better if the players don't have an option to do a certain thing. Because again, when you read through some of these monsters, and some of them are very cool. I like the Intellect Devourers. The Thought Eaters are very cool. They're like these skeleton ducks. Or at least that's what they look like. Excuse me. You know, it's all of this is cool, and there was a lot of work put into this. The abilities themselves are cool. Like I said, being able to not only protect yourself psionically, but use these psychic abilities in new ways and interesting ways is very cool. But it's so complicated, and there's just so much information that you would have to keep track of here, that it kind of takes the fun out of it. Which is a shame, because they have tried numerous times to make psionics work in Dungeons & Dragons. Basically every edition since 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons has had some form of psionic in it. And it's just never really caught on. It's never really taken. The one instance that I believe it did actually gain some foothold is in 4th edition, believe it or not. Now, I will profess that I know nothing about the psionics, and I could barely get through the the player's handbook and introductory material of 4th edition. So, safe to say, I know absolutely nothing about how psionics are in 4th edition, but apparently they're really good and are likely the best iteration of them. It sounded like they got a bit more streamlined, that they fit better with the systems in place, rather than sort of being their own thing, and if that's the case, that's great. I also know that they tried to bring psionics and or mystics into 5th edition, and eventually Wizards of the Coast basically admitted, yeah, if we ever do Dark Sun, we'll do it more seriously, but otherwise, no. Because, again, like I said, you can go watch that XP to level 3 video. He sort of sums a lot of it up as to why mystics are sort of not regarded all that well, and a lot of it goes into just how much there is going on. That is kind of the case, in my opinion, of why psionics, the opinions of one man, have never really taken hold in D&D. Because for as fun as all of this is, and this was a fun read, don't get me wrong. Like I said, the abilities are cool, the monsters are cool, the artwork's great. It's easy to read. They lay everything out very simply and understandably, which is very much appreciated. But by the time I got through this, my first thought was, holy hell. That was literally what I said to myself. Holy hell. There's just so much going on. So when you take a class that for everyone except the psionic, basically, when you take a class that is not very fun for anyone that is not the psionic to play or play with or account for, and then couple it with the fact that a lot of people felt that it didn't really fit in, you get, in my opinion, probably the worst regarded real attempt at a new class that D&D has ever made. And it's a shame, because I think there is probably a universe where psionics are fun to play. But I think at this point, they have such a stigma surrounding them that I don't think you could ever actually realize it without really, really heavy rewriting and redoing and remaking. But yeah, that is a sort of brief history on psionics. I would recommend, I don't know if you can get this, I don't know if this book is available online. I would imagine it is. But I would recommend you read this yourself, because you might find that you enjoy psionics, or at least enjoy elements. I think there are elements here that can very easily be attributed to and added to a campaign. Like I said, I would add most of the monsters and even some of the NPC elements, just because I think it would provide a unique sort of twist without becoming a burden on the table. So I think you should give this a read. I don't think this isn't Terrible Trouble at Tragedor or something like that, where it's like completely awful and not worth the time to read. Not at all. This is a fun read. I think there was real effort put in here, but I think it was almost doomed to fail from the start, because it just doesn't fit with the general world or gameplay of D&D. There is one instance in which psionics have been done very well. And we're going to talk about that actually in the next episode. We are going to talk about how one universe, really, one world, and if you are aware, it's Dark Sun. Basically, in the next episode of this D&D Module Monday, we are going to talk about how Dark Sun made psionics work, because they did. Psionics are great in Dark Sun. They fit the world. They work really well. And we will talk about that next time. But yes, I hope you enjoyed this very sort of brief, informal history of psionics and why I think they kind of have the reputation that they do. I think it's kind of unfortunate that this has never panned out. Sometimes not everything cool is good. Ooh, that's a very real quote. Not everything that's cool is good. Ooh. Either way, thank you so much for watching. Good to be back in the saddle to make another one of these. It's been a minute. Yes. I'm recording this. Well, it'll be released well after, but I'll say happy holidays anyway, because I'm recording it a couple days leading up to the holiday season. So please enjoy your holiday, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you in the next one.